my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Laura Kennefic from the U.S. Forest Service. She's a research forester and a team leader at the experimental station Penobscot. So, Laura.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to have been asked to speak with you today, and I want to thank Gaetan and all of the meeting organizers for the wonderful job they've done bringing us here. So today I'm going to talk with you about strategies for managing compositionally degraded mixedwood stands. And I want to begin by acknowledging some of my co-authors. That includes John Cabrick and Crystal Kern of the Forest Service, Patricia Raymond from the Quebec Ministry, Ben Knapp from Missouri, Lance Vickers from Kentucky, and Nicole Rogers from the University of Maine, who you're going to be hearing from later in this session. We are part of a research initiative that we informally call the Mixedwooders, and this work is the culmination of about 10 years of our collaboration. So I want to start by defining mixed woods. These are hardwood, softwood mixtures, and in that way they're distinguished from mixed species stands that might be, say, purely composed of hardwoods or of softwoods. In the case of mixed woods, neither component, the hardwoods nor the softwoods, exceeds more than 75 to 80% of the basal area of the stand. So these are stands that have an important component of the minor species. And there's been a lot of work done over the years here in Canada on boreal mixed woods. And in fact, if you do a literature search, there's a very deep literature available. Temperate mixed woods, those that consist of northern hardwoods and softwoods or of oak pine, have been much less studied. There has been work out of Quebec by Patricia Raymond, Daniel Dumais, and others, but particularly in the United States, this was a new idea. And when we started talking about mixed woods, folks often didn't know what they were. So this is an emerging area of research for us. So mixed wood stand composition can develop from a number of different pathways, and these can be either natural or anthropogenic. Now, the mixed woods that I would say have a natural disturbance origin are those that tend to be more stable. So they're perpetuated by the natural disturbance regime of the forest that you're in. However, we can also have mixed woods that have resulted from our harvesting or other land use activity. So here I have a couple of photographs, and these are from the same stand. So we see a photo on the left of a spruce fir hemlock stand in Maine in 1950, and then a photo of the same forest in 2010 that is now a fir maple birch stand. In this case, we have changed a softwood stand to an HS or hardwood dominated mixed wood. And this sort of brings up one of my points, is that all mixed woods are not created equal. There are certainly advantages to, say, a yellow birch spruce stand that one wouldn't necessarily find in a red maple fir stand. So when we think about the temperate mixed woods in the north and the eastern United States, I have here some examples of the kind our group has been studying, and these include hemlock hardwoods, predominantly sugar maple, but also American beech and yellow birch, spruce, fir, yellow birch, and a number of pine oak mixed woods. So this is white pine with northern red oak, pitch pine and mixed oak, and shortleaf pine and mixed oak. And I'm not going to focus on the oak pine mixed woods today, because I want to put my attention on those that have northern hardwoods with their softwood compatriots. So the characteristics of mixed woods are often that they are structurally complex and vertically stratified. This results from different shade tolerances of the component species, different growth rates, longevities, phenologies, and crown and root structures. Regeneration and growth strategies differ among the species that occur in these stands. And for this reason, regeneration recruitment can be particularly challenging when it comes to managing or maintaining desired mixed woods. So why would you want to manage for mixed woods? And I just touched briefly on the fact that some, the fir red maple, are perhaps not as exciting to foresters as others we might encounter. So there are potential benefits. This includes resistance or resilience to pests and diseases. So a really great example that I can think of is a spruce fir stand with a hardwood component that a lot of work here in New Brunswick has shown are less prone to having a negative outcome from a spruce budworm outbreak. There are biodiversity and habitat diversity benefits. Many of us are familiar with the occasional eastern hemlock that provides an important habitat for some species of birds in northern hardwood stands. We also have a diverse product stream. We saw a situation in Maine where I work where the traditionally strong spruce fir pulpwood market really collapsed within the last decade due to mill closures, and suddenly all those hardwoods that we had been killing over the years were relatively more valuable. We've seen some benefits related to production or over-yielding, where you add another component to the stand, you get more production than you started with. And there are benefits for carbon storage and compatibility with or adaptability to future climates. So these are all really important reasons why we might want to think about maintaining hardwoods and softwoods and mixtures. So how do we accomplish this? I mentioned the importance of focusing on the regeneration and recruitment phase. Here we have a couple of examples. We have the yellow birch and the spruce hardwood stand, and sugar maple and white ash and hemlock hardwoods in Wisconsin. So what are the specifics of how we put this into action? We're thinking about this as a critical stage of mixed wood stand dynamics. There are some common issues that we need to be aware of and account for in our management. There are some species that are more difficult to regenerate and recruit than others. This may be the result of depleted seed source from past logging, narrow regeneration requirements, perhaps they require a certain substrate in order to be successful. There is often hardwood competition, particularly from sprouting species. Here I'm thinking of red maple or American beech. The ones that we find difficult to perpetuate in these stands are what we call the limiting species. So they limit our ability to perpetuate the mixed wood compositions that we desire. And I have here a photograph from a stand in the Acadian forest that is a mixed red spruce, white pine, northern red oak, American beech, yellow birch, sugar, and red maple stand. Now in this particular case, some of these species are not going to be difficult to maintain in the future, while others are particularly challenging. The red spruce, the yellow birch are two that we have difficulty with. So here are some example mixed woods that contain northern hardwood species and an overview of the challenges that we want to acknowledge and manage for. So the two that I'm going to focus on today are the hemlock sugar maple yellow birch type and the spruce fir yellow birch. Now there are of course other hardwoods and softwoods in both of these. Northern white cedar can be a particularly important component of the spruce stands, and those would come into consideration as well. So in this case, the limiting species that we often see are the yellow birch, the eastern hemlock, the red spruce, and where northern white cedar is a component, that as well. The natural disturbances in these forest types tend to be frequent, small-scale, and periodic moderate disturbances. And this is important because we have the idea that having a silvicultural system that creates disturbances similar to what would naturally perpetuate these stands has a high probability of success. The regeneration in all these types, because of the shade tolerance of the dominant species, tends to be continuous to episodic. So again, the limiting species I'm focusing on today, the yellow birch, eastern hemlock, and red spruce. There are competitive disadvantages when all these species, when we want to maintain them in mixed stands with northern hardwoods and other conifers. The regeneration is primarily from seed, as opposed to sprouts or suckers. They have small seeds that require a receptive seed bed. That is often exposed mineral soil or highly decayed deadwood. And the deadwood in particular is something that we have been depleting through past management because we harvest trees before they die. That's often the objective of doing silviculture. We also see slow initial growth relative to competitors of some of these species, and that can put them at a disadvantage. There are also some limiting factors. I mentioned the importance of exposed mineral soil as one substrate for these, and yet we have increased hardwood litter and reduced deadwood from past harvesting. There are some other complicating factors that we need to account for. So the first is that rich sites favor competition. So we know this as site improves, we have a greater number of species that can be successful and can have a suppressing effect on the species we hope to regenerate. We also see that browsing reduces recruitment of some of these species. And we heard a presentation earlier today about this and how deer browsing in particular can be not only highly selective but variable over time. So there are places I know where the deer are eating all of the eastern hemlock and other places where they seem to be eating none. But these are species that can be greatly impacted by browsing. And there are also episodic insect outbreaks which reduce growth, cause mortality, or degrade the form, quality, and value of these. So what are the silvicultural solutions? We've talked about the species compositions of interest, the natural disturbance dynamics, some of the considerations related to their silvics. How do we then succeed in applying silviculture and stands to maintain northern hardwoods and softwoods in mixture? We think that the key is to focus on those limiting species, those few that provide bottlenecks in regeneration and recruitment. So here we see that regeneration methods with a high likelihood of success tend to maintain a seed source and partial canopy and to establish advanced regeneration. This is particularly true for the more shade tolerance. Selection system, either single tree or group. We've heard some presentations today about the limitations of those. Irregular shelterwood is a possibility. We're talking about things that don't remove the stand that you have before you have initiated the stand you want to replace it with. Forest floor disturbances can be beneficial. Certainly on very wet sites, this isn't appropriate, but on the sites where we're likely to have a component of northern hardwoods, we tend to have sufficient drainage to do some scarification. If we don't have adequate regeneration of the species that we would like to see, particularly where seed sources have been depleted through past harvesting, planting or direct seeding is a possibility, and this has been done operationally in some places. We find that release is really a key component of this. So releasing the limiting softwoods or the hardwoods, there's been work on early thinning of hardwoods up here in Canada during the recruitment phase with mechanical or chemical methods can be really important. Very often we can get these species established, but we can't recruit them in an adequate time to the merchantable size classes. So making that investment and going into the stand and doing some pre-commercial work if you have a high degree of competition can be beneficial. And here I would suggest this be done as a cleaning, so selected release of desired future crop trees in the sapling classes rather than a broader release that would be a greater investment. We also advocate for retention of some of the limiting species either permanently or for more than one rotation. So here's an example of that with red spruce. Some of these species have a longevity that exceeds that some of their competitors. We would call these two-rotation species. A colleague of mine who works in forest operations has actually started calling things like balsam fir half-rotation species to suggest that perhaps these longer rotations are appropriate and we don't want to be driven by these species with early physiological longevity limits. Okay, so when we think about a range of silvicultural systems, we have shade tolerance of the limiting species that ranges from high to low, and then we have silvicultural systems that can be loosely aligned with these. So we have selection, single tree, and group would be more appropriate for species with a very high shade tolerance, while those that have very low shade tolerance might be better perpetuated by seed tree or clear-cut methods. In the middle, when we think about intermediate shade tolerance, and this would be appropriate for yellow birch, and we've heard a lot today about the irregular shelterwood, a gradient from the irregular to regular shelterwood would be appropriate. So when I think about some of these mixed softwood and northern hardwood stands, for instance, the hemlock northern hardwoods, I think in this case you're falling on the end of a range from selection to shelterwood as the most appropriate treatments. Here you would establish and release advanced regeneration, do some seedbed preparation with mechanical scarification if advanced regeneration is lacking. We certainly do not advocate for that if you have desired advanced regeneration. And then you might have to do some competition control. Similarly, in the spruce fir hardwoods, and here I'm thinking about yellow birch as a frequently desired associate species, we would use a similar approach. And in here, we're going a little bit more on the larger opening size with an irregular shelterwood or another form of regular shelterwood. So let's kind of do an overview. Mixed wood management must focus on the limiting species. So those things that can be hard to regenerate and hard to recruit. Otherwise, the stands are likely to transition to sprouting or early successional hardwoods. For this limiting species, the silvicultural systems must maintain the seed sources until you have your new cohort established and recruited, create a suitable microenvironment for seedling establishment if it doesn't already exist, and create suitable conditions for recruitment. You also need to control competition through release. In order to accomplish this, we suggest that structure and composition must be managed at each entry. Now, that sounds a little bit different from what I just said. I was talking about a focus on regeneration and recruitment. But when you're dealing with things that you want to have advanced regeneration, you want to make sure that you have the species there on the site to regenerate the species that you want to have when you get to the end. So every time you go in, be it a pre-commercial entry, a commercial entry, be thinking about ultimately what you're going to want to have in the future forest, so you make sure to maintain those things now. So maintain species with different growth rates and longevities, including those 2 rotation species, and accumulate advanced regeneration, or in the case of the less shade-tolerant species, seed-producing trees. You need to account for the complicating factors, so site quality, potentially increasing competition, herbivory, and damaging insects or pathogens. In application, you want to consider tree species desirability as well as vigor and quality. So we heard some really provocative presentations this morning about considering vigor and crown dieback and marking. I think here, when we're doing our marking and our earlier interventions, the desirability of the species, its vigor, and its quality all have to be taken into consideration. If there is a history of degrading harvests, which quite honestly is the case in most of the stands that we all manage, so here again is my fir red maple with about 14 stems per red maple clump. This is not as desirable for many of the values we aspire to relative to, for instance, this lovely spruce fir yellow birch stand. So we sometimes hear about approaches to forest management where there's an emphasis on retaining the composition that we have in place. I think we need to think about whether the composition we have in place is what perhaps would have occurred on the site without our past management, and whether it's what we want for the future. So there are challenges and opportunities in all of these cases. We want to think about biodiversity and wildlife habitat. It's a really great reason to do some retention. Forest health, we have benefits from mixed species, carbon storage, and markets. There are some opportunities with mixed woods to achieve multiple objectives. So, for example, species diversity that is inherent to mixed woods can be beneficial for climate change resiliency. You also can use retention trees for seed, but also, if you keep them permanently, for snag and downed log recruitment. And the downed deadwood is suitable not just for habitat, we often think about downed logs, but for regeneration. And here is a yellow birch growing on white cedar logs. So putting this into practice, be sure to think about the silvics of the component species, focus on the limiting species and the 2 rotation species, and develop a long-term plan. This brings me to the catchphrase of our work, which is that silviculture matters. The decisions we make today, as you all know, are going to have a really profound effect on the opportunities that you have for tomorrow. So with that, I want to just mention briefly a coming soon attraction. We are working on a temperate mixed wood management guide. So this is a new product that we have just begun this fall. This is in collaboration with all of the folks you saw on the title slide and others. This will be applicable to the eastern US and Canada. It's going to consist of some definitions of mixed woods. We're going to have maps of different mixed wood types. We're going to talk about the relationships between soils and sites, the role of disturbance in maintaining these, the benefits and challenges of them. So sort of what I did today, but for a lot more mixed wood types. And then we're going to get really specific. So after that introduction, there's sections that talk about, for example, the spruce fir yellow birch or the northern red oak, eastern white pine, and we'll have information about each of those with silvicultural recommendations from experts in those areas. So this should be coming out in the next year to year and a half, and it's something that we're really excited about. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and if there's time, I will take a question or two.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Dr. Kenefick, for such an insight on a complex forestry challenge. So we have time for a couple of questions for Laura.
Just throwing this out, what's the biggest mistake that you see being made right now in these stand types?
Okay. I think the biggest mistake that I see happening is sort of managing for mixed woods on sites that wouldn't necessarily be mixed wood sites. And by that I mean there are some sites that are like mid-slope and would naturally support a really nice mixture of hardwoods and softwoods, and that's a place where maybe mixed wood management feels like a good opportunity, you know, to think about that and apply that. Where I come from, we have many, many acres of mixed woods that are that, for example, fir red maple type. And now there's an increase in interest in management of mixed woods, but I don't think it isn't about managing for something that is well suited for the site and is going to serve us well in the long run. It's sort of about making the best of a bad situation. The irony there is that red maple is a climate change winner, and so one could say that we've really done something awesome by converting a lot of our spruce, fir, yellow birch stands to fir red maple. But you know, I just really want to, I guess, make the point that mixed woods aren't a panacea, and all mixed woods aren't created equal. And so I just hate to see mixed wood management pursued in those situations where it's perpetuation of a degraded composition.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Woods